Patch 25.23 is upon us with some nerfs, some buffs, and some adjustments too. Starting with nerfs, we have Ashe, who is losing some attack speed on her Q. This is a fairly needed change to stop her from attack speed capping out at 2 items. Another ADC in the firing line is Caitlyn, who's losing some damage as the game goes on her passive to champions and monsters. Next we have Hui, where they're nerfing one of the most frustrating parts of his kit, where his QE won't scale quite as hard with levels, making him not quite the wave clearing threat he was before. Next, another ADC in Jinx, who's losing 50 base damage from her ultimate and a good chunk of AD scaling. This is a lot of damage to lose, but it will still hit like a truck. Next we have Kai'Sa, who's losing 2 base armor and also her ultimate being extended by 10 seconds at all levels. This definitely will hurt her survivability. Next we have a nerf for top lane Rek'Sai, where she'll gain less fury when attacking minions. And the final nerf goes to Vlad, who's losing 7 base health and 3 base armor. This is more of a nerf for top lane Vlad, and it will definitely make his laning phase more difficult. Heading over to buffs, the first one goes to Aatrox, whose passive and Q will now both deal more damage to monsters. This is the first of many buffs at many champions to try and make them more viable in the jungle. The next buff goes to Ahri, with her W dealing increased damage on subsequent hits. Rito are clearly trying to bring her back into the meta, but taking a more slow, cautious approach to it. We also have a jungle buff for Ambessa, where both uses of her Q will now deal increased damage again to monsters. This will actually be quite a decent help to her clear speed. Following this, we have a jungle buff for Cho'Gath, where his E will also now deal more damage to monsters. We also have a jungle buff for Jace, which is one of the stranger ones, where his Q in both melee and ranged form will now deal 50 bonus damage to monsters. This is definitely a solid buff for it, but it's going to be pretty niche. We also have a strong buff for Jhin, who's getting 2 additional AD, and his W is getting 10 extra damage at all ranks. With a lot of the bot lane meta being nerfed, Jhin could definitely take the spotlight. Next, we have a jungle buff for Malphite, whose W will now deal double damage to monsters. Following this, Miss Fortune's ultimate will now scale slightly better with attack damage. Next, we have Ornn, whose W will now deal a good amount additional damage to jungle monsters. This is actually quite good damage, and it really will be interesting to see if this ever takes off. Following this, Riven gets a jungle buff with her passive dealing 50 bonus flat damage to monsters. Sion's Q will now deal additional damage to monsters as well. And then we come to Skarner, who was absolutely butchered, where he's getting 1 additional AD growth per level, and the cooldown on his Q is being reduced and the max damage increased. Swain gets a nice buff with his E now dealing 10 more damage at all ranks and also costing less mana. Following this, Tristan is getting 0.4 additional AD growth per level. And following this, we have a buff for Volibear with 3 additional attack damage, as he absolutely fell off a cliff over the last few weeks. Next we have Xayah, whose passive is gaining additional damage against secondary targets, and the final buff goes to Zeri, whose ultimate will now grant more move speed per stack. Overall, just a lot of smaller changes. As for adjustments, Mundo gets a bug fix, and to counteract it, they're giving him a bit more attack damage scaling on his E. Fizz is getting additional armor, but his ultimate will have a longer cooldown, on top of both of his passive and W now dealing more damage to monsters. And Mel is gaining some damage on her passive, but losing a lot of root duration on her E.